Hey, Dave here, and in this 3-part series we'll discuss PowerNSX commandlets that allows us to create, edit, and remove NSX security policy rules. This first video focuses on the 5 highlighted commandlets, giving us the ability to create security policies with rules. But before we begin, let's talk about some common parameters that show up frequently in these commandlets. The return object ID only parameter returns only the object ID for a given NSX object. The connections parameter contains information on how to connect to the NSX manager and is used when API requests are made. And finally, the comments parameter supports parameters like verbose, debug, error action, etc., which add additional functionality to the commandlets and assists in troubleshooting. Okay, with the housekeeping stuff out of the way, let's talk about New-NsxSecurityPolicy/FirewallRuleSpec commandlet, which is an internal commandlet that creates security policy rules in the appropriate XML format. It is used by both the New-NsxSecurityPolicy and Add NsxSecurityPolicy/FirewallRule commandlets. This ensures properties required to successfully create a security policy rule are formatted properly before sending the API request to the NSX manager. The parameters associated with the New-NsxSecurityPolicy/FirewallRuleSpec commandlet are as follows. The category, which is a hidden parameter as the value has been predefined to firewall. Name, description, enabled, security group, service, logging, action, and direction. Okay, let's jump into a quick demo. As you can see, we predefine our firewall rule into a variable called $FW1. This variable is a hash table which contains key value pairs. The keys are everything to the left side of the equal sign, like name, description, enable. The values are everything to the right side of the equal sign, like rule1 description, $true. Note how the keys in the hash table match the parameters of the commandlet. This is by design as it allows us to use a PowerShell technique known as splatting to pass a collection of parameter values to a commandlet as a unit. Instead of using $FW1, we simply call the commandlet and use @FW1. In this example, we'll generate a formatted XML file. Next up is the new NSX security policy commandlet, which creates a security policy and uses the following parameters: name, description, firewall rule, and guest introspection service. The firewall rule parameter accepts a hash table and passes that information to the previously discussed new NSX security policy FirewallRuleSpec commandlet using the splatting technique. The guest introspection service parameter works similarly to the firewall rule parameter except passing its information to new NSX security policy GIS-spec commandlet. Since this video is focused on firewall rules within a security policy, we won't be covering the functionality of guest introspection. For more information about the new NSX security policy GIS-spec commandlet, I encourage you to run the following command. Okay, let's jump into a quick demo. Again, we predefine our firewall rules into variables. First, we'll create an empty security policy called SP-001. Next, we'll create a new security policy called SP-002 with firewall rules. It's important to note the order of which the rules are added to the firewall rule parameter, as NSX interprets the order by their index in the list. For example, since $FW1 is first, it will be rule 1, and $FW2 will be rule 2. If we decided to change the order to $FW2, $FW1, then $FW2 will be rule 1, and $FW1 will be rule 2. Finally, we'll create another new security policy called SP-003 and pipe it to the Add NsxSecurityPolicy/FirewallRule. As you can see, the last two examples accomplish the same thing. It comes down to personal preference. I personally leverage the pipeline as it allows me to string multiple commandlets together, as we'll see later. The Add NsxSecurityPolicy/FirewallRule allows the ability to add additional rules to either a new NSX security policy or an existing one. It too uses the firewall parameter. Other parameters included are the security policy and default rule. The default rule parameter creates a rule with default settings, just like when we add a new rule using the GUI interface. Simply provide it a name and the rest is taken care of. Let's jump back into the lab where we'll add a few firewall rules using the firewall rule and default rule parameters, as well as the pipeline. Here we'll create two new firewall rules with the firewall rule parameter and add them to security policy SP-001. Next, let's create another firewall rule for security policy SP-001, this time using the default rule parameter. And finally, let's add another default rule using the pipeline. Let's jump over to the GUI to confirm the security policy SP-001 has 4 firewall rules. And as you can see, we have our 4 rules inside security policy 001. To not be repetitive and to reduce the length of this video, the next demos will use the pipeline method. This method simply passes the object from the last commandlet to the next. For example, if we look at the last command we ran, get NsxSecurityPolicy SP-001, we piped it to add NsxSecurityPolicyFirewallRule using the default rule parameter. If we run get NsxSecurityPolicy SP-001 command, it returns the security policy as an object. This object is then passed across the pipeline to the next commandlet, which is why we don't have to specify the security policy parameter for the add NsxSecurityPolicyFirewallRule. Each commandlet discussed in this video has its own security policy parameter, so if we choose to not use the pipeline, simply call the commandlet with the security policy parameter and specify the name. The add NsxSecurityGroup security policy firewall rule commandlet allows us to add NSX security groups to specific firewall rules in a security policy. There are just 3 parameters: the security policy, security group, and the execution order. Let's jump back into the lab. In the first example, we'll create a new security policy called SP-004 with 2 default rules and 1 firewall rule. Then we'll add security groups SG-003 to rule 2 and SG-001 to rule 1. Instead of using the GUI to confirm SP-004 was created, let's use PowerNSX to make our queries. Let's store the results of get NSX security policy SP-004 into a variable called $query. Here we can validate that the rules were successfully created by navigating the properties of the variable and selecting the name property. To confirm SG-003 was indeed added to rule 2, we'll use the whereObject commandlet to filter on security groups where the execution order matches the rule we want to query. In this case, that's rule 2. In the next example, we'll add a security group to an existing security policy, SP-001, Rule 4. We'll again confirm this by querying Rule 4 in security policy SP-001. The final commandlet we'll discuss is add NsxService security policy firewall rule, which allows us to add services to a specific firewall rule in a security policy. It too has only 3 parameters, the first being security policy, service, and execution order. Let's jump back into the lab. In the first example, we'll add a couple services to rules 1 and 3 in security policy SP-004. Both rules were created using the default parameter, which means their service was set to any. Note the conditional operator cmatch is used because there are 2 services in the environment with the same name and ports. The only difference is the capitalization in their names. To show you, let's highlight the get NsxService TCP_8282. As you can see, it returns 2 objects, lowercase TCP_8282 and the uppercase TCP_8282. I hope in the future release, NSX won't allow this type of behavior, as it allows duplicate services to exist. Let's ensure only the lowercase TCP_8282 was added to Rule 1 in SP-004. In the next example, we'll create a new security policy called SP-05 and add 2 services to Rule 1. We query SP-005 to ensure both services were indeed added. Let's put all the commandlets together and create a fully functional security policy with rules, security groups, and services. We start by creating a new security policy called SP-006 and give it a description. Then we add a total of 4 rules, 2 created with the firewall rule parameter and the other 2 with the default rule parameter. Next, we'll add SG-002 to Rule 3 and SG-003 to Rule 4. And finally, we'll add service TCP_8282 to Rule 3 and HTTP, HTTPS, and SSH services to Rule 4. Let's jump over to the GUI interface, refresh, make sure we have SP-006 selected. And as you can see, the security policy with the firewall rules, security groups, and services were created. That's going to wrap up this video. In the next video, we'll discuss editing existing firewall rules in a security policy as well as applying the security policy to a security group using PowerNSX.